My name is Mike Miles, and I'm still from Birmingham, Alabama, and I loved watching you over the weekend, and I couldn't wait to see you again this morning. So it's good to see you. Susan, you want to say hello?
My name is Susan Firestone. I'm a retired patent and trademark attorney from Fort Wayne, Indiana. We just call it Washington here too in Indiana.
Good morning. I'm Dan Taubman. I'm a senior judge on the Colorado Court of Appeals in Denver, Colorado.
Tell us who you are and tell us about that remarkable woman sitting there behind you, if you'd like to, or whether the teacher is in the room, wherever your teacher is. Introduce them.
Hello, my name is Kanu Sethia, and the woman most inspirational to me is Marie Curie, her groundbreaking work in the field of physics and chemistry.
Hello, judges. My name is Hadley Johnson, and the woman most inspirational to me is Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson for being the first Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court.
Hello, my name is Olivia Cook, and the woman most inspirational to me is former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg for flourishing under adversity and her fight for access to illegal and safe abortion.
Hello, my name is Kirk Gallang, and the woman most inspirational to me is Sojourner Truth, her relentless fight for human rights and social justice. On behalf of Unit 3, our advisor Gretchen Wolfing, Tahoma Senior High School in Washington State, we thank you for joining us today.
Well, we thank you for being here on a Monday morning. Y'all did great this weekend, and I know you're going to do great today. This is going to be fun. Let's see. We're going to do question number 5 on the European Common Union this morning. I can tell Susan and Dan, this group could handle that. If we had a question like it, they could probably handle it. Do that good. Let's do question 1 today. You know this one by heart, but because Marcy, are we being recorded today? I thought so. So the people that watch this can know where you take us. I'll read it as quickly as I can. The right to vote was not expressly included in the U.S. Constitution of 1787. In your opinion, was the implied right to vote in the Constitution sufficient for the creation of a representative democracy? How did the expansion of voting rights affect the evolution of democracy in our country? Please give examples. And which is and here's the question, man, which is the greater threat to democracy, disenfranchisement or fraud? You got 4 minutes to tell us that. You ready? Please start.
Someone struggled for your right to vote. Use it. Susan B. Anthony.
The implied right to vote in the body of the Constitution has proven insufficient for the creation of a representative democracy.
Due to the implicit nature of the right to vote, many of the founding fathers believed that significant suffrage limitations were appropriate.
James Madison stated that universal suffrage leads to the rights of property or claims of justice may be overruled by a majority without property or interested in measures of injustice.
He and other founding fathers argued that voting rights should be only given to those with economic stake, therefore limiting the electorate and the participants in representative democracy.
The framers of the Constitution were unable to enumerate explicit voting requirements. Therefore, enfranchisement was left to the state's discretion.
For example, the 1776 New Jersey State Constitution illustrated that all inhabitants who met property requirements were enfranchised. However, in 1807, the state legislature restricted suffrage to only tax-paying white male citizens.
Therefore, the implied right to vote within the body of the Constitution produced contrasting voting requirements, leading to a limited electorate that was unable to represent the full consent of the governed.
The expansion of voting rights through court cases, legislation, and the amendment process is a crucial aspect of our ever-evolving democracy.
The 15th Amendment was the earliest expansion of voting rights, as it promoted universal male suffrage regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude.
However, United States v. Reese limited the 15th Amendment by stating it did not grant a right to vote, but simply prohibited disenfranchisement.
Furthermore, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections dismantled previous voter suppression tactics, thus expanding access to exercise one's right to vote and participate in our democracy.
Additionally, political pressures from the women's suffrage movement prompted Congress to pass a 19th Amendment granting women the right to vote. Despite challenges after its ratification, the Supreme Court upheld the 19th in Weiser v. Garnett, therefore solidifying the electorate and securing women's suffrage.
Furthermore, in Oregon v. Mitchell, the Supreme Court held that Congress only had the ability to dictate the age requirement for federal elections, while the age requirement for local and state elections must be left to the discretion of lower governments.
In response to protests arguing old enough to vote, Congress enacted the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18 years.
The expansion of voting rights has been a focal point in the evolution of democracy, as a previously silenced electorate through disenfranchisement and voter suppression, is equipped with a voice and an instrument for change.
The greatest threat to democracy is disenfranchisement rather than fraud due to its impacts on felon and minority voters. For example, California felon voting case Richardson v. Ramirez solidified the precedent enacted by the 14th Amendment, allowing the disenfranchisement of felons unless on the grounds of race.
This has led to 5.2 million Americans, which is approximately 2.3% of eligible voters, being disenfranchised because of prior convictions.
Another prominent example of disenfranchisement among citizens pertains to citizens residing in territories of the United States, most notably Puerto Rico, which does not have voting representation in Congress.
Approximately 3.7 million potential voters who reside in Puerto Rico are denied voting rights on the national level, contradicting the meaning of democracy valued by Americans. Courts have even stated that Puerto Rico, like the state, is an autonomous political entity.
In terms of numerical significance, voter fraud occurs less frequently and on a smaller scale in the United States.
For example, in 2005, Washington utilized a vote by mail system. During the 2016 presidential election, the system flagged only 74 out of 3 million ballots cast in Washington as possibly being fraudulent.
The fear of fraud catalyzes the growing dissension throughout the voters of America, as a democratic society that cannot trust its elections is not a society at all. Thank you.
Thank you. Olivia, you must have had a stern talk with Kirk to make him so agreeable during the essay part. That was pretty good, right? Judge Taubman, I've had a chance to question these guys on Saturday I guess on this very question. So if you would like to start with your gerrymandering question or some other, I'm going to yield to you if you'd like to have the first go round with them.
Thank you, Mike. Can you share with us your thoughts about what types of gerrymandering exist and how the Supreme Court has decided cases involving gerrymandering?
One of the types of gerrymandering that currently exists is racial gerrymandering, which was outlawed in the court case Shaw v. Reno. It's important to note that while racial gerrymandering was outlawed in Shaw v. Reno, like my colleague said, Chicago, Illinois, 4th Congressional District does contain a concentrated population of Latino individuals, which would give descriptive representation to these individuals. It's important to note the difference between equitable practices in achieving equality rather than suppressing minority voices.
To answer my colleague, we could see that partisan gerrymandering was ruled unjusticiable by Rucho v. Common Cause. We have seen the impacts of this by Maryland and South Carolina and North Carolina being using political gerrymandering by both parties.
We have,
Go ahead, Susan.
okay, we have a lot of people that are eligible to vote and maybe even registered to vote that are US citizens, but they don't vote. They don't show up on election day. Do you have any reason, or can you think of a theory on why people would do that and what we could do to stop that?
One way that voters don't show up on election day is due to the fact that they cannot get time off work to do so. Many voters are impoverished and live paycheck to paycheck and need to work in order to survive. Adding on to this, making voting a federal holiday would allow for people to get the time off work that they need without having to sacrifice their wages. To add on to my colleague, another way to remedy a better voter turnout would be to allow and give transportation to individuals in the state and even country to access to polling site locations.
Both my colleagues, the rise of more restrictive voting ID laws in many states has served as a barrier for many Americans from voting, as almost 11% of Americans do not have government authorized IDs. Thank you.
To add on to my colleague, there's a specific group would be Native Americans, as they do not have street addresses, they cannot obtain ballots.
To answer all my colleagues, a reason why some people vote is because of the belief the lesser of two evils, in which people disagree with both of the two major political parties. We can see this in the 2016 election with Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I believe a remedy to this would be civic education.
Thank you.
Wow, I love listening to that. That's amazing. We talked a little bit about this the other day. New York has recently passed a law, among other states, you know what I'm going to say, allowing non-citizens to vote. I think it's only in local elections. Is that right? How do you feel about that subject?
citizens should be allowed to vote, as even the framers and founders of this country believe that individuals with economic stakes should be allowed to vote. These non-citizens have jobs and are contributing to the economy of the United States, and thus should be able to vote on the founders' beliefs. To respectfully disagree with my colleague Hadley, I believe that non-citizens should not be allowed to vote. The citizens who have immigrated to the United States may not be fully educated on the basis of America's culture and their voting system and should not be allowed to vote.
To respectfully disagree with my colleagues, I myself am a legal permanent resident, therefore I'm a non-citizen. However, in my own King County, as I turn 18, I will be allowed to vote in King County.
Shout out to my colleague Hadley. I would state that it is important that all legal permanent residents also have the right to vote, as in the 14th Amendment, it states that all people under the jurisdiction of the federal government deserve the equal protection under the laws, and voting is an implied right that is in the body of the Constitution.
Does it matter which level, for those of you who think they should, or even those that don't, should that be restricted to local elections only? Or, state elections, that's okay, and federal not? Or should that right be extended to all three levels?
We can see in the case of Yickwell v. Hopkins that they state that voting is a preservative of all rights, therefore stating that if legal permanent residents and other citizens should not are allowed to vote, they should get access to all voting. I do not believe this is the case. I believe that we should restrict that to only state and local elections.
To agree with my colleague Olivia, the state's governors and representatives know their constituents the best. However, the individuals who may not be citizens may not be assimilated to the American culture and may not have as much education on who may be running for office.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Judge.
In your opening statement, you described felons as one category of disenfranchised Americans. Is there a difference between felons who are currently serving their sentences and felons who have served their sentences but are still disenfranchised in your view?
Yes, we can see that in the 14th and the 13th and 14th Amendment, that individuals that are currently being punished for their crimes do not have equal protection of the laws or the right to voting. However, those that have already been incarcerated and then released from prison do deserve their voting rights back, as they are functioning members of society once again.
To add on to my colleague Kanish, the individuals who have paid their time in jail or in prison are subjected to modern day poll taxes that were eliminated in the 24th Amendment.
To elaborate on my colleague Kelly, she's referring to Florida's bill of felon voting, where felons are forced to pay any fines or any fees they may have collected while in prison and before. This disenfranchises felons until they are able to pay these off, which may be increasingly hard to do, as it is very hard to get a job when you are straight out of prison.
Thank you. Susan?
We've discussed about voting. There's a flip side to that too, about ballot access. And certainly, for say getting on the ballot itself. Do you have any ideas on that, or any thoughts on that? Should we limit the ballots to a certain number of voters, or should we just have it open?
I believe that other countries in the United States should be able to utilize a laboratory of democracy, as Washington does and has mail-in ballots. We know that laboratories of democracy were established, I believe, in the ICE committee, and that it would give more access and a more safer approach to polling site locations, as individuals who may not have the access to the polling site locations would be able to have the ability to fill in a mail-in ballot.
To elaborate on my colleague Hadley, in order to gain more access to ballots, we could try to utilize electronic ballots, which would allow our ballots to be translated into more languages rather than major languages such as English and Spanish.
Moreover, we can also look to legislation that should be passed to increase ballot access, such as making Election Day a federal holiday, which would allow more individuals to actually take time off of work and make the sometimes arduous drive to a ballot box and cast their vote and make their voice heard.
That's my colleagues of legislation that my colleague is referring to is the Freedom to Vote Act, as well as the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would provide a more uniform election system throughout the United States. Another example of this would be making mail-in ballots uniform throughout the entire United States.
Susan's questions this morning, both her questions have changed what I was going to ask you now. Sometimes when we're talking with remarkable students your age about why we can't get more people to vote, we'll go the extra step and say something like, should you be allowed to vote on your phone or on your pad, if you're registered to vote. And most students say that that's the worst idea they ever heard, because they know some of their classmates wouldn't be ready to take advantage of that opportunity. We got a minute. What do you think about that?
I believe that you should be able to vote from your phone or from your iPad. I believe that electronic voting would give way in the future and allow those who cannot leave the home to be able to vote. To disagree with my colleague, I believe that younger individuals, while they may be more technologically advanced, they would be under the influence of their parents. And if we did want to implement voting to younger individuals, then like in the state of Washington, we should require civics courses throughout their entire senior year, or even just classes in high school that would properly educate them on voting.
To respectfully disagree with my colleagues, I am disapproving of this idea of voting on your phone or iPad because it.
Go ahead, Kirk, finish up.
Thank you. Because it falls into the line of election integrity and whether our ERIC system, which is electronic registration system, is capable of doing so.
That's outstanding, guys. Really good.
Thank you, students. We'd like to congratulate you and your very outstanding teacher. I'm going to turn it back over to the judges so they can provide feedback.
Susan and Dan, I tried to tell y'all about Kirk. Hadley said non-citizens should vote. Olivia disagreed, and Kirk said, I disagree with my colleagues. Now that should cover pretty well what, he disagrees with both sides. That's what I love about Kirk, because buddy, I do too sometimes. So I appreciate that a lot. Susan, what'd you think?
Okay, I enjoyed your prepared remarks very much. You started off talking about an implied insufficiency, because if it's just implied, what does that mean? I mean, is it some penumbra there? Having spent time yesterday on penumbras, but I love the fact that you went into the James Madison quote, though, because you really encapsulated what they were concerned about. Is they were concerned about the riffraff being able to vote and possibly vote them out of office. So that was a real problem, and that was a nice quote. But you also brought up that New Jersey in 1776 allowing people to vote just because they have property, and allowed, free blacks, that allowed women to vote that had property, and they were disenfranchised in 1807, and that was actually at the behest, some of that, of the federal government. So that was nicely done. And then when you talked about expanding voting rights, you also expanded your depth on where you went. So I enjoyed it. It was easy to follow. And I enjoy the fact you brought up about the fact that the territories don't have the full franchise either. And you mentioned Puerto Rico and all of the territories, which I find kind of intriguing because they're US citizens, that they don't have the full franchise. And you mentioned the greatest threat was disenfranchisement, and then you explained why. So it was nice. And then we had a good follow-up as well, as you mentioned gerrymandering, you mentioned the Chicago, the racial gerrymandering, partisan gerrymandering. So you also mentioned the voting idea. So a lot of stuff there, and a lot of times I would like to time on, including one of my favorites, trying to actually get on the ballots so you can be voted for is a real trouble. It's really troublesome as well. Mm-hmm. So, and I would love to have heard you talking about that, but darn it, we ran out of time.
I love that question though. Ballot access is a real problem.
It's a real problem, getting on the ballot and being able to access your ballots. It's a problem for all kinds.
It really is. We don't talk about that very much. That was great. Judge?
So,
excuse me, I thought you did a really nice job. And like Susan, I liked your quote from James Madison in your opening statement, and your discussion of some of the Supreme Court cases, Harper v. Board of Elections and Oregon v. Mitchell, and your mention of the Voting Rights Act. In your opening statement, or you might have mentioned the 24th Amendment. You did mention it in passing in response to one of our questions about felons, but I'm not sure that the 24th Amendment would apply in that circumstance because it applies to poll taxes or other taxes. But on the other hand, I was very glad to see that you mentioned the disenfranchisement of felons as an area where voting rights are often not provided or not permitted. You might have had some statistics about which states, how many states disenfranchise felons and how many disenfranchise felons forever, as opposed to disenfranchising felons just while they're serving their sentences. I did really like your suggestion about having electronic ballots. That seems like something that we are likely to see in the future, and so I was glad to see that you were discussing that as a way of dealing with limitations on voting. There were a couple of points on which you disagreed that Mike mentioned, and I think that was good. That shows you're thoughtful and that you're having independent views on some of the issues we're discussing. So I appreciate very much your presentation today.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Judge. And you're exactly right. Hadley and Olivia don't agree on much of anything, apparently. They disagree. But I suspect that that's their job, and Canucci's the leavening factor down there. And I tease them about that. I told them before we came in here that I love this group. I love this unit, and I love this group with you because you, Hadley, when you answered my question about non-citizens, I was nodding my head. I agreed with it. And then Olivia made her case for why they shouldn't vote. And I said, well, you know, she's right. So y'all do a good, when you cover it, when you cover both sides, Judge, they cover it convincingly. I love the transportation idea. In Alabama, we leave picking up voters and getting them to the polls, to the campaigns, to the candidates who are picking up their voters. But public transportation ought to make that available a lot more often down here than they should. I don't know what happens in Washington.